Okay, starting. There I am. Okay, we're live. In fact, let me. Welcome back to Sunday school. And my camera is not wanting to do this. Deactivate and activate. There we go. I am going now. This is one of my groups on Facebook is Yada, YADA, Sunday School. Okay, pull up my daughter used my laptop, so now I'm having to go back and put a lot of this stuff back in. That's what it is. It's not what I want. Anyways, that's me. That's it. That's all right. So while I'm pulling up the scripture, good morning and welcome back. Been doing this book called Revealing Revelation. It's by a Messianic Jew named Amir Tsarfati, and he's a former major in the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Force. He runs a non-profit tour company in Israel. So if you go there, you could actually get in with this company and get tours of Israel. And part of that is evangelizing as Messianic Jew. And it's interesting. I like to get the Messianic perspective just because these are Jews who have been raised in the Old Testament. So they have a deeper understanding of some of the stuff that we take for granted or don't really think about. So there's symbolism that they pick up on that we may not. And somebody I knew turned me on to this guy, and I watched a few of his videos. He travels the world, he preaches, he evangelizes, and I saw this book, I went through it, I said, yeah, I'll do this. So we're on chapter 12, which at this time does coincide with Revelation chapter 12. And so last time we were talking about we were going through the trumpets. There's 3 sets of judgments in the book of Revelation. You have the seal judgments, which are the first thing that John sees. Then you have the trumpet judgments, and that's what we just finished going through. And then what's coming down the road are the bowl judgments. Things are being the wrath of God being poured out, kind of a thing. And so that is. But we haven't got to the bowl judgments. We are in. That pulls that up. Come on. Work with me here, program. All right. There we go, chapter. So anyways, we were talking about the 7th trumpet, which is actually it's the tail end of chapter 11. And I didn't get real close into it. And this looks different, but you know what, we'll take it. So copy that. And browser. So I'm usually going by this point, so it sounds like I know what I'm talking about. Okay, and it will shrink myself here. Where did it go? Maybe we won't. No. All right, well, we don't have time for that. So you can look it up yourself in your own Bible. Okay, so the final trumpet doesn't necessarily bring in a judgment. It brings in a worship service. And so, we were talking about the 2 witnesses. If you ever watched the Left Behind movies, like the Kirk Cameron ones, it was was it the 2nd or 3rd where they actually have the 2 witnesses and they're like shooting fire out their mouths? I mean, that's straight out of the Bible. People that are going to try and attack the two witnesses to stop God from, having his word preached and being prophesied and praised and all that sort of stuff. They're able to defend themselves up to a point, and then, of course, then they do die, but they're resurrected. And so when we get to the seventh trumpet, though, and this is Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 18, that the seventh trumpet signals the end of the first half of the tribulation. And I've made mention of this before, but it's kind of hard to nail down a timeline on a lot of this stuff. We know that the tribulation is 7 years long. And we know things like 3.5 years of like a false peace, and then 3.5 years of war, and you don't know how long these different judgments are going to last. There's only one that we know of in particular that's going to last. The Bible specifically says 5 months, and that's the locusts that come out of the pits of hell, or the bottomless pit, and but we find out here, when you get to Revelation chapter 12, we find out actually that the first two sets of judgments happened during the first half of the tribulation. So we are kind of given a time frame here. And that's one of the things that I've said with this before is the more you read, the more it tells you, and the better you understand. So a lot of times people think that, well, they read a passage and I don't understand that. And then they get kind of flustered and what does it mean? What does it mean? And they put it down, and then nobody else can tell them. Or, well, if you read a few more verses down or you read the next passage below it, it actually, most of the time, will explain what you just read. And if you read the whole entire book of Revelation, this is something that Amir gets into in this chapter, is that if you read the whole thing, it may take a few chapters, but it does explain, like what we're going to get into here in just a moment in Revelation 12. There's stuff in Revelation 20 that explains who some of these characters are and what's going on here. So like I said, we do know now that we get to chapter 12, which there's 20 chapters in the whole book, so you're over halfway through, which actually lines up with the time frame. And it's the end of the false peace, which is also the technical end of the Antichrist. Now, the Antichrist really hasn't been introduced in Revelation yet. He's coming in a few more chapters. But we know from a lot of preaching and teaching from everybody else, the way that I've been able to piece things together for a timeline is that when the rapture happens, that takes, God's influence, his hand holding back the enemy right now is taken away. The church is taken away. Our influence and God's influence is taken away from the earth. And so you end up with the one world government, one world economy, one world religion. The Antichrist will come to power, and we're going to have this 3.5 years of false peace. And so we've just hit the end of that. So during this seventh trumpet blowing, what John sees next is like a worship service in heaven. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Ron Wyatt. He has allegedly found the Ark of the Covenant, which basically at the end of 2 Kings, it basically goes missing. And he found Noah's Ark, which has been confirmed. They've got satellite stuff. Turkey was actually at a point where they were trying to make a park out of it for tourism. All kinds of terrorism stuff going all around you, but you can go visit Turkey and you can go to this park. Now, I don't know what the final status of that park is. That'd be something interesting to look up. But what's interesting to me, the reason I say that, is that John is seeing the Ark of the Covenant in heaven, in the throne room of God in heaven. So whether or not God actually took the Ark off of the earth, or whether or not it actually did get hidden away, when they were under siege, they found tunnels leading out from the original temple complex, and they found these tunnels that go out underneath the city and go a pretty good distance. And where there was a siege wall that was built, he found this. Ron Wyatt found this little cave kind of thing, these cracks in the walls and stuff. And he worked with the Muslim tour guide he had with him, ran like crazy, scared to death when he thought he saw what Ron was talking about seeing. And there was this little chamber that actually had a little tunnel leading from it. And he looks over into it, and there's a box, and it's got like these cherub angel things on top. He claims to have seen the sword of Goliath, uh, Moses' staff, and a few other things that would have been key things they would have preserved when they were evacuating the temple from Jerusalem being taken over. But anyways, that's what I say is interesting, because John sees the Ark of the Covenant in heaven, but do we have to have it here on earth? I mean, that's a question thing. That's not a it's not a theology thing. It's just that's a curious question to ponder, because we're never really going to have the real answer until we get to this point. And all right, so anyways, Revelation chapter 12, starting at verse 1 through 4. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. The being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain gave birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So we've left the worship service in heaven, which John's back on earth getting these visions now. He's no longer in the throne room of heaven. And he's given this vision, this sign. A lot of signs, again, you read further into it, or if you've actually been reading your Bible, certain parts of this, you go, okay, yeah, hey, that was Isaiah talked about that, Job, or Daniel, or it was prophesied through some of the Psalms. And so this is the kind of thing you get into. People like to allegorize, or they like to apply their own personal viewpoint to try and justify themselves or their position, whatever it is they're trying to do. But if you take it at face value, you take it word for word. Now, clearly we know these are signs. So we know this is a vision. But again, the imagery lines up with stuff we've already read in the Bible. And of course, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet. And at first you might say, well, who is that? But as you read into this, and you say, okay, and she's wearing a garland of 12 stars. Well, that's usually referring to the 12 tribes of Israel. So this woman's this is actually talking about Israel. And so this is if you were to condense everything into one little brief statement about the story of the Bible, this is it right here. And so the woman being Israel, obviously, and she's having a child, and she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Israel had to get to a point where the whole nation, when you read the Old Testament, you go through Kings and Chronicles, when you get into stuff with the prophets, you see that when Israel would disobey God, when they would start worshiping false idols and things of that nature, you find out that in order for them to get right with God, the whole nation had to come together and cry out. They had to ask God to ease their suffering, defeat their enemies, whatever. And then he would send a judge, or he would send a prophet, or eventually a king. And, so that's what's going on. Well, that's what led up to Christ coming. Whatever God's timeline was, he decided, hey, that's it. This is the time. And, I've had enough. I'm going to send Christ, and we're going to finish this. And so that's the child we're talking about here. So the woman is Israel, the child is Christ, and of course, the dragon is Satan. Now, I'm not going to get into all the how many heads and horns and all that. That's coming. That will be explained. But of course, the dragon is Satan, and that lines up with everything we've seen so far. It's when Satan rebelled, and I've heard some false teachings on this from different pastors, people that have been around preaching for a long time. They kind of get this a little mixed up because I've heard people say that Satan can no longer get into heaven and the angels can't, the demons. That's not correct. Because as you read in Job, if you go back and read Job, Satan's going back and forth. And he's actually goes before God and he's like, hey, your people only follow you because you give them nice things. And so, we see this interaction between Satan and God. And we hear directly from Satan that he's been going to and fro. And so what we know then, up to this point, Satan and the demons actually still have access to heaven. They're not citizens of heaven anymore. They've been kicked out. But part of the thing is that Satan has this plan that he's going to take the throne from God, right? And so when he is in the garden and God pronounces the curses on Adam and Eve and then the serpent, which is Satan, and as soon as Satan hears that he's going to be defeated, his head will be crushed. I mean, that's her heel will crush his head, right? So he's been working ever since then. He's been working for the last roughly 6,000 or so years to stop God's plan. And so his initial thing was he was going to stop the Israelites as he was watching and paying attention. Okay, God has chosen these people to be his emissary, so to speak, to be the light unto the world. And so he's been working to stop them. Well, then he tried to kill the Christ. Remember, all the newborn babies, everybody under 2 years old was going to be killed, and they ran off to Egypt. And so Christ was safe. But then once the devil figured that out, he thought he was going to be able to kill Christ, and he got crucified, of course, and all this plays into God's hands and plays into his ultimate plan for how things are going to work. All right, so any questions so far? Is there any? I try not, I'm kind of stuck in this lecture mode because there's usually nobody here. it's just me. I like discussions and questions though. So if something does pop up, feel free to stop me. So that's what's going on here is Satan, and like I said right here, that the fiery red dragon was waiting to devour the child as soon as it was born, right? And he failed at the crucifixion. He thought he succeeded, but when Christ rose from the dead, he failed. And so now it's like some of our politicians. When they want things a certain way, but they're losing, they're going to cause as much damage and destruction as they can on the way out the door. I mean, maybe people like that, not just politicians, but people in general. When they figure out that everybody's onto their schemes, then they're going to, when you're finally getting rid of them and you're getting them out of your life, they're going to sit there and just attack you and cause as much damage and trouble and rumors and whatever until you finally get rid of them, right? Well, that's where Satan is at this moment. He's becoming desperate, and he's realizing he's losing. It's finally catching up to him. And so we see in verses 7 through 13 of chapter 12, we find out that war breaks out in heaven. So Satan, which he only took a third of the heavenly hosts with him, right? When we find that out in Isaiah, which is also confirmed back here in verse 3 or 4, I guess. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them down to the earth. Now, that's not, obviously, again, if you've been reading through Revelation so far, God's been taking out a bunch of the stars. He's been taking out a bunch of these darkened things. He's done all these things with these different judgments. So that's clearly not talking about the stars in the sky. This is talking about the angels that sided with Satan and rebelled against God, right? So Satan has 1/3, and this is what killed me. He's outnumbered 2-1. Two-thirds of the angels, 2/3 of the heavenly hosts in heaven have stayed faithful to God, and here he is with 1/3, and he thinks he's going to go up and he's going to battle God in heaven. He's going to, when the archangel Michael, and who becomes head. Satan was originally the chief angel. He was originally the chief worship leader in heaven. So he was like the number one guy. Well, now that he's out of the picture, the archangel Michael is now the number one guy. So he commands the armies of God, all these angels, right? So they come down. Satan goes back up to heaven with all the angels with him. So that's what I say. If Satan was stuck on earth, then he wouldn't be able to do what he's doing right here in chapter 12. He wouldn't be able to go back up there and start a fight, which is exactly what he did. So they go up there and they fight. And again, he's desperate. And, we all like the underdog, but in this case, you don't like the underdog. It's you don't want to root for the little guy this time because the little guy is evil and he's wrong. But it's one of those things that the hubris of Satan, he's so full of himself that he thinks that he's going to be able to go up there and defeat God's army. And so the archangel Michael meets him. They have a battle, and he loses. Satan loses. They're not destroyed, but they're defeated. And then now they are officially cast down to earth, where they cannot go back into heaven. And so this marks the midpoint of the tribulation. This is the end of the 3.5 years of peace. Now, again, we say it's a false peace because when you go back and you read the previous chapters of Revelation, you see the persecution against the followers of God. You see of course, there's the judgments being poured out, and when God sends a judgment down, whether it's a seal or a trumpet, whatever, when he sends a judgment down, instead of majority of those people realizing that they had done wrong, they continue to do wrong, and they deny God and they deny Christ, and so they don't turn back to God and seek forgiveness. They dig deeper into their sin. They dig deeper into their rebellion. And so, here we are. That stuff's been going on, even though you have, the one world government has solved all your problems. The one world religion has fixed everything. The one world economy, everybody is looking like they're eating and drinking and things are going well, but they're really not. Behind the scenes, that the news isn't telling you about the hit squads that are coming out from the government that are going after the followers of God, which at this point is primarily Jews. There's going to be Gentiles, but most of this is, the whole thing about Revelation is that it's for the Jews, to bring the Jews back to that point where they cry out to God. That's been the whole thing all the way through the Bible. The Jews have to get to a point where they cry out to God, and that's true for us. We have to get to that point in our life where we cry out to God for salvation, where we cry out to God for help in our lives. And, that's usually, you got to hit the rock at the bottom. You got to go so far that you hit that rock at the bottom before you're able to come back up. And of course, that rock is Christ. And once you find Christ, once you find salvation, and you've really, truly, in your heart, reached out to God, that's when things start to get better. They don't necessarily get easier, but they get better. And you find peace, and you find healing, and spiritually first, and then, mentally and physically, potentially, depending on what God's plan is. But that's where we're at in the tribulation. We're halfway through it, and Uh, like I said, Satan's was defeated up in heaven, but he's not yet defeated on earth because obviously we have 8 more chapters to the book of Revelation, and we have to get to whatever the other famous battle of Armageddon, which is there's an actual um, valley called Megiddo. Everybody's looking at all this stuff saying that's where the battle is actually going to take place potentially, and which Revelation is the translation of apocalypse, apocalypto, to be revealed. The term Armageddon means revelation as well. It's like Greek and Hebrew and Latin and stuff. These different words. We've settled in the English language on revelation, but you could say apocalypse. We've kind of changed the meaning of that to mean like big destruction thing, but and it's not really. It kind of cheapens the word, but it's a revealing of who God is and what God's plan is and how we fit into all that. So that's where we're at. We're halfway through the tribulation, and uh, it's now comes the big battle. So the next 3.5 years in the tribulation period are going to be an actual all-out war here on earth, because as Satan has been defeated and he's kicked back down to earth, they're going to do as much damage as they can on the way out. So they're going to start fighting against the followers of God down here on earth, the Jews and whatever Gentiles that come along and decide to worship God during tribulation. He's going to be going after all of them on a massive scale. They won't be hiding this in the news anymore. This won't be something happening in the background. They won't be claiming that they're whatever. It's just an outright attack and an assault on. And again, if you've been reading Revelation, the Jews were actually told to go hide in the mountains. And so now Satan and all his demons are going to be going after the Jews in the mountains. They're going to be the ones that have been hiding to be safe. Now they're coming after them. So that's where we are. And it's going to be a particularly short video, a late start, but there's not much more to get into with this. Like I said, where the stuff about Satan having all the heads and the horns and the diadem, all that stuff will be explained in the coming chapters. And of course, chapter 13 next week is, now he says the Antichrist comes to power. I read into this again. I think the Antichrist is in power at the beginning of the tribulation as the head of the one world government. Now, is that exactly right? I guess we'll find out. It may be open to interpretation. We know for a fact the Antichrist will be in charge of Satan's armies because he's going to give him power and control. So,